Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Theodora Part 10, This Is My Empire by Extra History. Now this is part of their Justinian and Theodora series, but this one is just titled Theodora, so I'm guessing we'll get a lot of the Empress in this one. So last time we saw as Belisarius was preparing for a massive confrontation with the Persians, but then they sort of surprisingly backed off. Now, Belisarius might not have known in that moment, but the reason, most likely, was because a plague was descending upon the land, and that plague would not be limited to their territory. In this episode, I imagine we're going to be seeing how Rome deals with that plague, a strain of the Black Death, essentially. So, this might be a bit of a dark one. Now, before we get into this one, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
As the great empires battled in the scorched plains of the Middle East, a new threat began to creep its way onto the scene. It was at first a small thing, a local thing. A man in Pelusium dies. But this death served merely as the starting bell, the catalyst for a time of chaos and dread. A darkness reached out from the borders of Egypt and unleashed a horror never before seen on the world. That man in Pelusium had at first felt only a fever, but then a strange fog descended on his mind, accompanied by a swelling of great black pustules on his thigh. Then he began to vomit blood, and his skin began to decay while he still lived. He had the plague. This outbreak in Pelusium is the first recorded instance in world history of the plague. But still, Pelusium was a somewhat isolated place. Sure, rumors began to spread across the empire of a town transformed into a living hell, but at first they were only rumors, horror stories to share at night. But then the plague moved up to Alexandria, the jewel of Egypt, and that horror became very real.
Yeah, and of course we know from a lot of history how devastating the plague could be. I believe the bacterian name is Yersinia pestis, which is, we're talking essentially about another strain of plague, like the Black Death that we might be more familiar with, though this is often referred to as Justinian's plague, which may not be entirely fair. The man was not in charge of a sort of natural event, an epidemic like this, but it was one of the things that characterized his reign, and it already is and will be as devastating as other instances of the plague that we can all think of.
The great port city of Alexandria fell into chaos. No medicine or prayer could stop the ravages of the disease.
And I mean, this is, I talk about this on my channel sometimes. This is one of those moments when a sort of natural event, right, this is an epidemic, can really change the course of history. I mean, you think about the Black Death outbreak in medieval Europe. That is one that absolutely changed the course of history. It really altered the economic and social dynamics of a lot of Europe, really changed a lot of things moving forward. This is another one of those instances where this plague will really change the course of history.
People spoke of the end times, of the wrath of God, and people died. Unfortunately, Alexandria was one of the great ports of the ancient world. It was a center of trade. It provided grain to the greatest cities of eastern Rome. And so from there, from port to port, the Great Plague made its way across the Roman world. In 542, it reached Constantinople. The horrors it inflicted cannot be overstated. 1 in 4 people in the great city died.
Jesus.
Like, imagine that. Imagine if 1 out of every 4 people you knew just vanished. Imagine what it does to an economy, to the functions of trade and of state. How does a world run when suddenly, for no rhyme or reason, 1/4 of its people are snatched up by the jaws of death?
Like I said, an event like this can and does completely alter the, politics of a place, society, economics. I mean, really, society on every level is altered when you have 1 out of 4 people dying. That is an absolutely monumental number.
and those left alive had other grimmer duties. Those struck with the plague didn't die in ways that were uniform. They fell victim to different symptoms, sometimes suffering delirium, sometimes falling into a catatonic state. Some men felt such great thirst that they would run outside, wild, and drink from the fountains until they died.
Yeah, and I mean, you can talk about the people. The biggest impact is, of course, the people that died. You're just lost a big chunk of, your labor force, of people who could serve in the military, of your population. There's that. But then, of course, there's also the other impacts, the people that got sick but survived. The psychological impact of all of this, that is really a massive thing. You can imagine what sort of scar this leaves across the psyche of your population. Like they said, a lot of people thought that this was the end times. God was raining down punishment upon them. This was, you can imagine, deeply, deeply traumatizing for people, and really changed the course of everything for people that survived, both due to the sort of practical, real-world impact of that many people perishing to the plague, and also the sort of political, social, psychological impact of living through and experiencing all of this.
Their bodies half in and half out of the water. Those who slipped into a coma-like state wouldn't die immediately, not if they had somebody to tend to them. They would eat and drink if nourishment was put to their lips, which meant that many of their loved ones lived with the specter of death, caring for those they love as buboes grew and burst. And those who fell into a coma without somebody to care for them, they starved to death without even knowing, bodies sealed in houses with no one to discover them until the stench became too great. It was said that no man was seen on the street unless he was carrying a corpse. Justinian had set up an office to handle the burials when the plague first struck, but no functionary, no office of state could keep up with the tide of death. First they filled the cemeteries, then they dug up all the open land in Constantinople to bury the dead. Then, in the state's final days of dwindling functionality, they had dug mass graves outside the walls. But soon these too were filled. Grave diggers tried to press the bodies down and pack them in. As everything unraveled, people just began to dump the bodies into the sea, which only led to bloated corpses washing up along the shore. They also tried filling boats with corpses and pushing those out into the waves. All along the Mediterranean world, ghostly ships, manned only by the dead, would find their way to the coastline, bringing a cargo of bodies riddled by the plague. Finally, the people of Constantinople took to simply packing the corpses into the guard towers that lined its great wall. When the wind blew, the stench of decay covered the city. The queen of cities was a ghost town. Those the plague didn't kill, it often drove mad with horror or grief.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to everything they're laying out, it honestly sounds like an apocalyptic time to live through. Just the horror of the situation, the disease, the bodies, the smell. I mean, it's disgusting, it's horrifying. Like I said, the psychological impacts that would have on you is not to be underestimated.
Suicides increased dramatically, and all over the world, reports spread of grim apparitions, plying the waters in brazen boats, or spreading the plague by a touch of their ghostly hand. Whether they were phantoms of men's plague-addled minds, or merely the specters of fear is unknown, but these demonic visions gave men even more reason to keep hiding behind locked doors. And with all of this happening, harvest couldn't be collected, crops rotted in the fields, and famine loomed. And the plague spared neither the old nor the young, holy men or scoundrels, rich or poor. Everyone got the plague. Everyone. Including Justinian.
Yeah.
The emperor fell into a deep coma.
The emperor himself was infected by the plague. And plague is one of those things that, I mean, it does depend on the plague, but I think especially highly communicable, deadly plague is one that no matter your level of power or influence, it's very difficult to protect yourself from it. Especially if you don't understand how it works. You don't understand how to protect yourself, then it doesn't matter how powerful or rich or influential or well-known you are, you can be affected like anybody else. Now, like I said, it does depend on the plague. For most of these, and people have understood this for a while, isolation and quarantine are sort of the best option, even if there are no good options. So maybe, if you're really rich and influential, you can try to the best of your ability to isolate yourself. But in a plague like this, that's not really a realistic opportunity. Maybe, like I said, it does depend on the pandemic or epidemic you're talking about. But in this case, yeah, everybody was getting sick and dying, even right at the very top.
Soon, the buboes appeared on his thigh. Every day the city prayed, but everyone knew the plague's course. It was here that Theodora stepped in. Make no mistake, throughout Justinian's reign, she was working behind the scenes. During the course of his rule, she had worked to find space for both Orthodox and Monophysite Christians in the empire. She had fought for the rights of women, and she had always helped with imperial policy. On top of that, Theodora had also served as a sort of...
If I remember correctly, Theodora always had a bit of a religious interest, and she was sort of working behind the scenes to, influence religious proceedings out in the open. And with Theodora, Empress Theodora, we see, I think probably a fairly ambitious woman, judging from what we know about her, and how she, has acted and the things she said. Seems like her husband, she was quite ambitious, but of course an ambitious woman at a time when it wasn't really acceptable for women to be public figures, at least in most cases, maybe the rare exception, or the rare role that allowed a woman to have that degree of influence. And so, well, actually, Theodora is in one of those rare places where she can have a lot of influence, but can't necessarily be a super public political figure. Right? She has to act behind the scenes. And this is often what we see throughout history, is women in these courts, whether they're part of the royal dynasty or just a member of the court, they have a lot of influence and a lot of power, but they're not necessarily socially allowed to exercise it out in the open. They have to exercise it behind the scenes, influencing the men around them, right? To try and make these decisions. And though that may at times limit the degree of influence you can have if you can't get out there as, a sort of openly political public figure, though of course the Empress was a public figure in some ways, you can still have a lot of influence from that position, and Theodora certainly did.
Informal spy master for Justinian's regime, uncovering plots and fending off any internal threats to Justinian's power. In fact, she had just recently forced Justinian's ruthless taxman, John the Cappadocian, into exile as a priest as punishment for his willingness to entertain a plot against the emperor.
Damn.
And here, now in this critical juncture, as Justinian lay comatose, Theodora took up the fallen reins of power.
Right. And of course, this is a particularly dangerous moment. We've already talked about how Justinian was at times suspicious about plots against him, or those he felt may have been plotting against him. Earlier in his career, he dealt with the Nika revolt, which had a good chance of overwhelming him and kicking him out of power. So you've always got to be careful. Though he's a very well-established emperor, successful emperor at this point, when you're in your weakest moment, you still have to be very cautious. And given the state he's in, he can't necessarily defend himself. Well, literally, but I mean more politically. He's going to have a hard time, sick as he is, fending off political plots against him. And so he needs the people around him, in this case primarily Theodora, but also, the other people around him who are loyal to him to do that work for him. And he has to trust that they will step in on his behalf when necessary.
A remarkable thing. To think that she could do this, that she could hold all of the jackals and potential usurpers at bay. All around, there were generals with armies at their call. The empire itself was in a state of disarray. Any one of these generals could easily claim that the current regime had been forsaken by God, that the emperor had no clear heir, and by all accounts he was weeks from death at most.
Yeah.
At no point since Nika was control of the empire more tenuous. When you consider the fact that Rome, even Eastern Rome, had so often suffered civil wars and rebellions, it's incredible that in the midst of this plague and conflict, armies of Romans didn't array themselves against each other, spilling Roman blood to elevate some other ambitious man to the purple. But Theodora served as a unifying thread, as a continuation of Imperium. She made all the decisions that would normally come to Justinian. She held the court together and acted as a symbol
Continuation of Imperium, I think, is probably a good way to put it. As Empress, she sort of literally represented a continuation of Imperium, even if Justinian died. power wouldn't have gone to her, it would have gone to some other successor, but with him alive, she very much represented sort of an extension of his power and was able to sort of represent him politically, represent his imperium, represent his legitimate authority, and I think that lended a lot of credence to her ability to influence things, and also to his authority in this moment when it might otherwise have been lessened. And Justinian, he's one of these guys who he doesn't necessarily have a long dynasty behind him. His uncle Justin was essentially an upstart, rose from essentially nothing to the position of emperor, which was then passed to his nephew Justinian. So Justinian doesn't have that long line of predecessors to call upon. Now, that can be difficult. You don't have that pedigree. I think it does make people more willing to overthrow you, sort of lessens your legitimacy a little bit. But what it does mean is that as Justinian has risen up, he has brought a lot of people with him, put a lot of people into places of power. And so there are probably a lot of people in and around his court who owe their position and their authority to him and will still be loyal to him until the winds change, right? That's the thing. Loyalty can be pretty fickle. If people think, if the momentum is against you, people even who may have been loyal might be willing to turn their backs on you. Now, this is sort of that moment for Justinian, but with people who owe their loyalty and their position to him, and Theodora out there representing him in politics and, extending his authority past, him sick in bed, I think this is how he's able to hold on to power.
Perseverance for a city and a nation going through unimaginable suffering. But most of all, she acted quickly and ruthlessly, bringing to heel anyone she suspected might attempt to supplant Justinian. She had men of power arrested, she had generals recalled from their armies, and she had her courtiers listen for any sign of sedition. And through doing so, she prevented the civil war that should have come. But one of the men she'd had to recall...
And before we get to that, think about it. You're dealing with this absolutely disastrous plague. If you imagine, what's about the worst thing that could happen to the Empire right now? It might be a plague of this scale. And somehow, mass civil war was averted. And this is, in an empire where civil war could occur like that. It didn't take much for civil conflict to spiral out of control. This is the damn Roman Empire we're talking about. The Romans, one of the things they were absolutely best at were fighting other Romans. So it is quite the achievement. But, as we're about to see, that decisive, quick action sometimes catches people up. And Belisarius Justinian's been a little suspicious for a while. I always, I'll rep Belisarius, I'll defend him. I don't think, I think Belisarius was loyal, but once again, he's in a dangerous position for himself and for Justinian.
Call was Belisarius. The world knew of his promise to never seek the purple while Justinian lived, but Justinian was on his deathbed. Many naturally assumed that Belisarius would simply take on the mantle of emperor once Justinian passed. And though he had tried to quiet those rumors, numerous Roman factions had started to campaign for pushing out the existing imperial family and installing Belisarius instead.
But we saw during the Nika revolts, one of the members of the prior dynasty, who didn't really want to be emperor, was essentially forced into that position. And you have Belisarius here, who is very popular, very successful. He's a successful, popular general. If you're the emperor, that's just about the most threatening thing you can see. I talked about this before, but what was Julius Caesar? He was a successful, popular general. And many successful, popular generals throughout the history of the Roman Empire have simply stepped up into authority, either by taking out the emperor or just stepping into his place after he was gone. So Belisarius appears very threatening, he's very popular, and even if he isn't interested, and I do think he wasn't, or at least he wasn't interested in overthrowing Justinian. Now, was that due to genuine loyalty, or did he just think it was a bad idea? I don't know. We can't see the inside of his brain. We don't know what was going on. Seems to me he was loyal, right? He had a lot of opportunities to prove himself disloyal, including the offer to, take the crown and rule over Italy, which he didn't. I mean, he accepted the crown on paper and then marched into the city and took it for Justinian. I think that is, in my opinion, sort of proof of loyalty, but of course to Justinian that whole thing was very suspect. And this is a man who, even if he says, I don't want to be emperor, I don't want to take over, everyone's like, yeah, we love this guy, make him emperor. And that just causes more issues for him.
And thus, Theodora recalled him, tried him, and confiscated the vast wealth he had accumulated during his campaigns. She would later use her friendship with Belisarius' wife as an excuse to restore him to favor, but for now he was stuck cooling his heels in Constantinople, and safely removed from the power struggle, but also from the battlefield.
Yeah.
Luckily for the Byzantines, this plague had struck the Persians as well. The war was by no means over, but there was a lull as each of the great empires struggled with their own internal problems, and tried to keep their expensively trained troops away from the plague rather than fighting in the field. And so, for weeks, Constantinople existed in torpor, stunned and reeling from the catastrophe that had befallen it. But then, the impossible happened. Justinian woke up.
Yeah, my man survived. My man actually survived. Now, to be fair, I mean, he had Well, I was going to say he had a better chance of not than surviving, because we talked about the percentage of people that died. But then I reminded myself, I don't know what, if you got sick and were, bedridden, at that point, I don't know what the chance of survival was. I think it probably felt like very low chance of survival at that point. Maybe it was better than you might think. I don't actually know the statistics or how the disease necessarily works step by step. But just the image of the emperor bedridden and sick, you saw everybody was preparing for what was next. Everyone probably felt like, well, it's over for old Justinian. It's time for something else to happen. But that actually wasn't the case. He recovered and was able to, return to, not that he ever left his position as emperor, but was able to return to action, return to leading the Roman Empire. So we're not done with Justinian yet. This episode was called Theodora. She was sort of the starring character. But we've got 2 more episodes of Justinian, and we get to see sort of the end of his reign as emperor. How did everything end? What did he truly accomplish in the end? And maybe we'll even get to talk about the aftermath of his rule a little bit. I don't know. I'm speaking a little too early. We're not even there yet. We got 2 episodes left. So, if you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.